Every morning at 5 o'clock sharp, before the Alabama sun even thinks about rising, I make my way to this old wooden porch with Mama's Bible clutched tight in these weathered hands. The floorboards creak under my feet just like they did when I was a young bride, just like they did when I raised my 3 babies, just like they'd done every single morning for the past 43 years since Harold went to his eternal rest. This particular morning in July of 1959, the air hung thick with humidity and the promise of another scorching day, but there was something else hanging in that air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The crickets were finishing their nighttime symphony, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear old Mr. Peterson's rooster announcing the approaching dawn. I settled into my rocking chair, the same one Harold made for me during our first year of marriage, and opened Mama's worn leather Bible to no particular page. The gold lettering on the cover had faded years ago, and the binding was held together more by prayer than glue at this point. As I sat there in the pre-dawn darkness, with nothing but the porch light casting long shadows across the cotton fields, I had no earthly idea that God Almighty was about to answer the prayer I'd been praying for weeks. I had no idea that he was fixing to use the most unexpected messenger to show me the truth I'd been begging him to reveal. Now let me tell you about Pine Ridge, Alabama, population 847 souls, give or take whoever might be visiting their kinfolk that week. It's the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where the biggest excitement is usually Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning apple pie at the county fair, and where the Baptist church sits right in the center of town like the beating heart of our little community. I've lived here my whole life, all 82 years of it, and I've seen this town through the Great Depression, through 2 world wars, and through more seasons of plenty and want than I care to count. The main street runs just 4 blocks long, with Hutchinson's General Store on one end and the train depot on the other, and every building in between holds a lifetime of memories for folks like me who never saw much reason to leave. Folks around here know me as Ruth Whitman, Harold's widow, the woman who brings casseroles to every funeral and never misses a Sunday service. They know I raised 3 children mostly on my own after Harold got called up to serve in Korea and came home in a pine box draped with the American flag. That was back in 1951, and Lord knows it feels like yesterday and 100 years ago all at the same time. My oldest, Mary Sue, married well and moved to Birmingham where she's got herself a fine house with indoor plumbing and electric everything, plus 2 grandbabies I don't see near enough. She sends letters every few weeks, always ending with "Mama, you should come live with us in the city," but Pine Ridge is where my roots are planted, and I'm too old to transplant now. My middle boy James is following in his daddy's footsteps, serving his country somewhere overseas that he can't tell me about in his letters, writing messages that always end with "Don't worry about me, Mama," which is like telling the sun not to rise, because worrying about my children is what I do best. But it's my youngest, Tommy, my baby boy who turned 19 last spring, who's been keeping me awake at night and driving me to my knees in prayer more than any mother should have to bear. That boy has been running wild ever since he graduated high school, drinking with the Miller boys who never amounted to much, staying out till all hours doing God knows what, and breaking his poor mama's heart with every reckless choice he makes. Just 3 days ago, Sheriff Morrison himself brought Tommy home in the back of his patrol car, drunk as a skunk and twice as ornery, his good church clothes torn and his face sporting a bruise from whatever foolishness he'd gotten himself into. The shame of it nearly killed me right there on the spot. Ruth Whitman's boy, arrested for public intoxication and disturbing the peace, the whole town talking about it before breakfast was even served. What would the church ladies whisper behind their prayer fans? What would Pastor Williams think when he heard? But more than my wounded pride and more than the embarrassment that burned in my cheeks, I was terrified for Tommy's soul, terrified that my baby boy was headed down a road I couldn't follow, couldn't save him from, no matter how hard I prayed or how many tears I shed into my pillow at night. You see, child, when you've been a Christian woman your whole life, when you've taught Sunday school for 37 years and led the church choir and organized more potluck dinners than you can shake a stick at, there comes a moment when you start questioning whether God really hears you anymore, or if maybe he's just gotten tired of listening to the same old woman asking for the same things over and over again. I've been faithful, Lord knows I've been faithful, through Harold's death, through raising 3 babies alone, through lean years when the cotton crop failed and rich years when it flourished, through sickness and health and every blessing and trial in between. But sitting there on that porch in the early morning darkness, with Tommy's latest disgrace weighing heavy on my heart, I found myself wondering if maybe my prayers were just bouncing off the ceiling like a child's rubber ball, never making it past the peach tree in my front yard, let alone all the way up to heaven's throne. The doubt crept in slow at first, like water seeping through a crack in the foundation, but once it started, it spread faster than kudzu in July. Was I doing something wrong? Had I failed as a mother? Was there some sin in my life that was blocking my prayers from reaching the Almighty's ears? I'd read every book in Pastor Williams' library about raising godly children, I'd fasted and prayed until my knees were raw from kneeling on the hardwood floor, I'd claimed every Bible verse about training up a child in the way he should go, but Tommy just kept straying further and further from everything I'd tried to teach him. And the worst part, the part that made my stomach churn with shame every time I thought about it, was that deep down in the secret places of my heart where I didn't let nobody else see, I was starting to wonder if maybe God had given up on Tommy too. Maybe some children are just too far gone, too hardened, too set in their wicked ways to be saved. Maybe my baby boy was one of those prodigal sons who never comes home, never realizes what he's lost until it's too late. The very thought of it made me feel like I was committing some kind of blasphemy, questioning the Lord's ability to reach anybody, anywhere, anytime he chooses. But there it was, sitting in my chest like a stone, the fear that I'd been praying to empty air, that Tommy was beyond help, and that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the faithful servant I'd always believed myself to be. So that morning, as the sky started to lighten just a little bit around the edges and the first birds began their tentative songs, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to ask God one more time, but this time I was going to be specific, bold, maybe even demanding in a way that scared me a little. I was going to lay it all on the altar and ask him to show me the truth about what to do with my boy, and if he didn't answer, well, then I'd know where I stood. I closed that old Bible and set it down gentle like in my lap, then I folded my hands the way Mama taught me when I was just a little bitty thing learning to say my bedtime prayers. But this wasn't going to be no bedtime prayer, no sir. This was going to be the kind of prayer that Jacob prayed when he wrestled with the angel, the kind that says, I will not let you go until you bless me, even if the blessing comes wrapped up in something I don't expect or don't particularly want to hear. I took a deep breath of that humid Alabama air, thick enough to swim through, and I started talking to the Lord like he was sitting right there in Harold's old chair beside me, because truth be told, that's exactly how I've always pictured him, close enough to touch, close enough to hear every word, every sigh, every heartbeat. Lord Jesus, I said out loud, not caring if the neighbors heard me, not caring if they thought old Ruth Whitman was finally losing her marbles, I need you to hear me clear as daylight this morning. I've been asking and asking about my Tommy, praying and pleading and begging, but I don't know if I'm getting through to you or if I'm just talking to myself like some crazy old woman who's lost her way. The words came pouring out of me like water from a busted dam, 30 years of faithful service and faithful doubt all mixed up together in one desperate plea. I don't know what to do with that boy, Lord. I don't know if I should keep bailing him out of trouble, keep making excuses for him, keep hoping he'll turn around on his own, or if I should step back and let him face the consequences of his choices, even if it breaks my heart to watch him fall. Sheriff Morrison says Tommy's heading down a road that leads to prison or worse, and I believe him, Lord, I surely do. But he's my baby, my youngest, my last connection to Harold, and the thought of giving up on him feels like giving up on everything I've ever believed about your grace and mercy. I was crying by then, not the quiet tears of a dignified church lady, but the ugly, desperate sobs of a mother who's watched her child choose destruction over blessing time and time again. So here's what I'm asking you, Lord, and I hope you'll forgive me for being so bold, but I need you to show me the truth. Not what I want to hear, not what's easy or comfortable, but the honest truth about what you want me to do with Tommy. I need a sign, Lord, something clear and unmistakable, something I can't explain away or rationalize or pretend didn't happen. I need you to use whatever means you see fit, a person, a circumstance, a voice in my head, I don't care what, but show me what to do. Show me whether to keep fighting for him or let him go. Show me how to love him the way you love him, even if it means loving him enough to let him fall. The sun was starting to peek over the horizon by then, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange and gold that would have taken my breath away any other morning. But right then all I could see was the weight of that prayer hanging in the air between me and heaven like a bridge I was afraid to cross. I'm putting this in your hands, Lord, I whispered, wiping my eyes with the hem of my house dress, and I'm trusting that you'll answer in your time and your way. But please, please don't let it be too late for my boy. Don't let it be too late for me to do the right thing, whatever that might be. And then I sat there in the silence that followed, listening to the world wake up around me, the roosters crowing, the screen doors slamming as neighbors stepped out to collect their milk bottles, the distant sound of the 6:15 freight train whistling its way through town, and I felt something shift inside me, some kind of peace that comes from finally letting go of trying to control everything and everybody around you. I didn't know how or when or where God would answer that prayer, but for the first time in weeks, I truly believed He would. I just had no earthly idea how soon that answer would come, or how different it would look from anything I could have imagined. The moment those words left my lips and that prayer settled into the morning air, the doubt started creeping in like unwelcome visitors at supper time. What had I just done? What kind of presumptuous old fool asks God Almighty for a sign like she's some kind of Old Testament prophet expecting burning bushes and parting seas? Mama always taught me that faith means believing without seeing, trusting without proof, accepting that the Lord's ways are higher than our ways and His thoughts higher than our thoughts. But here I was, 82 years old and supposedly wise enough to know better, demanding that the Creator of the universe give me some kind of supernatural telegram about how to handle my wayward son. Maybe I'd been reading too many of those dramatic Bible stories about Moses and Gideon and asking for fleeces and miraculous signs. Maybe that kind of thing was meant for the great men of faith in the scriptures, not for ordinary church ladies from Pine Ridge, Alabama who couldn't even keep their own children on the straight and narrow path. The more I thought about it, the more foolish I felt, sitting there in my rocking chair like I was somebody special, like I was entitled to direct communication from heaven just because I'd been faithful all these years and tithed my 10% and never missed a church service except when I had the influenza back in '54. Who was I to think God would drop everything He was doing running the universe, answering the prayers of millions of people who probably had bigger problems than mine, just to give Ruth Whitman a personal revelation about her troublesome youngest son? The rational part of my mind, the part that balanced the church budget and organized the Christmas pageant and kept track of everybody's birthdays and anniversaries, started making a long list of all the reasons why I should take back that prayer, should apologize to the Lord for my presumptuousness, should just accept that some things in this life don't come with clear answers or heavenly instructions. Tommy was going to do what Tommy was going to do, and maybe the best thing for both of us was for me to stop trying to control the situation and just let the chips fall where they may. After all, hadn't I done everything a mother could do? Hadn't I raised him in the church, taught him right from wrong, prayed over him every night of his life, set a good example by living according to Christian principles even when it was hard, even when it would have been easier to take shortcuts or compromise my values? If Tommy chose to throw all that away, if he chose drinking and carousing and running with the wrong crowd over the foundation I'd tried to give him, then maybe that was between him and God, and maybe I needed to step back and let divine justice take its course without my constant interference and worry and maternal manipulation. But even as I tried to talk myself out of that bold prayer, even as I attempted to convince myself that I should just accept whatever happened without asking for any special guidance or intervention, something deep in my spirit kept pushing back against all that reasonable, sensible thinking. Something that felt like the voice of faith itself, small and quiet but persistent as a mockingbird at dawn, kept whispering that maybe, just maybe, the God who counted every hair on every head and knew every sparrow that fell from every tree might actually care about one worried mother's desperate need for wisdom. Maybe the same Lord who told his followers to ask and keep asking, to seek and keep seeking, to knock and keep knocking, wasn't offended by my boldness but was actually pleased that I'd finally stopped trying to handle everything on my own and had turned to him with complete honesty about my need for help. Maybe faith wasn't just about accepting whatever happened with a sweet smile and a "thy will be done" attitude, but also about believing that God wanted to be involved in the everyday struggles of his children, wanted to guide and direct and comfort and counsel those who came to him with sincere hearts and genuine desperation. As I sat there wrestling with all these thoughts, the sun climbed higher in the sky and the heat started building for what promised to be another scorching July day. I could hear Mrs. Patterson next door starting her washing, and somewhere down the street a dog was barking at the mailman making his early rounds. Normal life going on all around me while I sat in the middle of what felt like a spiritual crisis, trying to decide whether I was a woman of great faith or great foolishness. Finally, I made up my mind to do something practical, something that would get me up and moving instead of sitting there going around and around in circles like a dog chasing its own tail. I needed to go into town anyway to talk to Mr. Henderson at the bank about Tommy's situation, see if there was any way to work out some kind of payment plan for the damages he'd caused during his latest bout of public intoxication. It wasn't something I looked forward to, having to discuss my son's troubles with a man I'd known since he was in short pants, but it had to be done, and maybe the walk into town would clear my head and help me think straight about all this prayer business. I stood up slowly, my old joints creaking like the floorboards, and smoothed down my house dress with hands that were still trembling slightly from the intensity of that morning's conversation with the Almighty. Whether God was going to answer my prayer or not, whether I'd been wise or foolish to ask for such a specific sign, life still had to be lived and responsibilities still had to be met, and Tommy's problems weren't going to solve themselves while I sat on the porch debating theology with myself. I walked back into the house with more purpose in my step than I'd felt in weeks, that prayer still echoing in my heart like church bells on a Sunday morning, and I knew exactly what I had to do, even if I wasn't entirely sure why I felt so compelled to do it right then and there. The house felt different somehow as I moved through the familiar rooms, the kitchen where I'd fed my family for decades, the parlor where Harold used to read his newspaper by the window, the narrow hallway lined with photographs of better times, as if that conversation with the Almighty had shifted something in the very air itself, charged it with possibility and expectation and something that felt dangerously close to hope. I went straight to my bedroom, the same room Harold and I had shared for 23 years before the good Lord called him home, and I opened the wardrobe that still smelled faintly of his aftershave even after all these years. Hanging there among my everyday house dresses and my winter coats was my best dress, the navy blue one with the small white flowers that I usually reserved for Easter Sunday and funerals and other occasions that required a woman to look her absolute finest. It seemed foolish to wear such a dress just to go into town on a Thursday morning to discuss my son's legal troubles with the bank president, but something inside me insisted that this wasn't going to be just any ordinary trip to town, that this was the day I'd asked God to show me the truth, and if he was going to answer that prayer, then I ought to be dressed appropriately for whatever divine appointment he might have arranged. I took extra care getting ready, brushing my gray hair until it shone and pinning it up in the careful arrangement I'd learned from my mama all those years ago, when being a lady meant knowing how to present yourself with dignity no matter what storms might be raging in your personal life. I put on my good pearl earrings, the ones Harold gave me for our 10th anniversary, and I dabbed just a touch of rose water behind my ears, not because I was trying to impress anybody but because Mama always said a Christian woman should be a sweet fragrance wherever she goes, a living testimony to the beauty and grace that comes from walking with the Lord. Then I reached for my good leather handbag, the one I'd been saving for special occasions even though Harold used to tease me about having a purse that was fancier than some people's Sunday clothes, and I carefully placed Mama's Bible inside, right next to my coin purse and the little lace handkerchief that had belonged to my grandmother. That Bible had been my companion through every major decision of my adult life, every crisis and celebration, every moment when I needed to feel connected to something bigger and more reliable than my own limited understanding, and I wasn't about to venture into town without it, especially not on a day when I'd been bold enough to ask the creator of the universe for a personal revelation. As I snapped the handbag closed and checked my reflection one more time in the dresser mirror, I felt a strange combination of nervousness and anticipation, like a young girl getting ready for her first church social, uncertain what the evening might hold but somehow certain that it would be significant. The woman looking back at me from that mirror was 82 years old, with lines around her eyes and gray in her hair and the kind of weariness that comes from carrying other people's burdens for most of your natural life. But there was something else there too, something that hadn't been there when I'd looked in that same mirror the night before, a kind of expectant faith, a readiness to believe that God might actually show up in the middle of an ordinary Thursday in Pine Ridge, Alabama, and turn everything upside down in the best possible way. I walked through the house one more time, checking to make sure the coffee pot was turned off and the back door was locked, ordinary domestic tasks that felt somehow momentous on this particular morning, as if I was closing one chapter of my life and preparing to open another without having any earthly idea what the next page might contain. I paused at the front door, my hand on the brass knob that Harold had polished to a shine every Saturday morning of our marriage, and I whispered one more quick prayer, not another bold request for signs and revelations, but just a simple "Lord, help me be ready for whatever you have in store," before I stepped out onto that porch where the morning had started with such desperate pleading and uncertainty. The sun was fully up now, already promising another sweltering day, and the neighborhood was coming alive with the familiar sounds of ordinary life, screen doors slamming, dogs barking, children playing in distant yards, but I felt like I was walking through a different world entirely, a world where anything might happen, where God might speak through the most unexpected circumstances, where the answer to a desperate mother's prayer might be waiting around any corner. I walked down those front steps with my head held high and my good handbag clutched firmly in my right hand, feeling every bit the Christian lady my mama had raised me to be, but also feeling something else, something that made my heart beat a little faster and my steps fall a little lighter on the dusty sidewalk that led toward town. I was walking into whatever adventure the Lord had planned for me, dressed in my finest and carrying His word close to my heart, ready to receive whatever truth He might choose to reveal about my Tommy, about myself, about the mysterious ways He works in the lives of ordinary people who dare to believe that He's still in the business of answering prayers and performing miracles, even in small southern towns where nothing much ever seems to happen except the same old struggles and sorrows and small joys that have been repeating themselves for generations. The walk into town took me past all the familiar landmarks of my lifetime, the Hendricks place with its white picket fence that James Henderson painted every spring without fail, the old oak tree where Harold carved our initials back when we were courting and thought we had forever stretching out ahead of us, the little stone bridge over Miller's Creek where I used to take my babies to feed the ducks when they were small and innocent and thought their mama hung the moon. Every step on that dusty sidewalk felt weighted with the morning's prayer, with the audacious request I'd made of the Almighty, and by the time I reached the outskirts of Pine Ridge's tiny business district, my heart was beating so fast I wondered if folks might be able to hear it from clear across the street. But as soon as I saw the first familiar face, Mrs. Adelaide Thornton sweeping her front porch steps with the same fierce determination she'd been applying to that task for the past 30 years, I felt my spine straighten and my chin lift in that automatic way that comes from a lifetime of being Ruth Whitman, the preacher's widow, the woman everybody in town looked to as an example of Christian dignity and strength. "Good morning, Mrs. Thornton," I called out with a smile that felt almost natural, despite the turmoil churning in my chest like a washing machine full of muddy clothes. "Lovely day the Lord has blessed us with, isn't it?" And just like that, I slipped back into the role I'd been playing for decades, the part of the gracious Christian lady who had everything together, whose faith never wavered, whose children were all sources of pride rather than heartbreak and worry and sleepless nights filled with desperate prayers that seemed to bounce off the ceiling like rubber balls. Mrs. Thornton straightened up and leaned on her broom handle, ready for the kind of neighborly chat that was the lifeblood of small southern towns, where everybody's business was everybody else's business and privacy was about as rare as snow in July. "Why, good morning, Ruth, honey. Don't you look nice this morning? That dress is just lovely on you," brings out the blue in your eyes something wonderful. The compliment warmed me despite everything else that was weighing on my mind, because Adelaide Thornton wasn't the type to hand out false flattery. If she said you looked nice, you could take it to the bank. Thank you kindly, Adelaide. I had some business in town this morning, thought I'd dress appropriately for the occasion. The words came out smooth as honey, not betraying for 1 second that my business in town involved discussing my son's arrest and figuring out how to pay for the damage he'd caused while drunk out of his mind and making a public spectacle of himself and our family name. Well, you certainly accomplished that goal, sugar. How are your children doing? I haven't seen Mary Sue since Christmas, and I know James is still overseas serving our country. That boy of yours is such a credit to our community, following in his daddy's footsteps like that. My smile never faltered, even though the mention of Tommy by omission felt like a knife turning in my chest. Adelaide knew perfectly well what had happened 3 nights ago. In a town this size, news traveled faster than gossip at a church social, but Southern politeness demanded that we dance around unpleasant topics like they were sleeping rattlesnakes, acknowledging them only through what we didn't say. Mary Sue is doing wonderfully, thank you for asking. She's got those 2 precious grandbabies keeping her busy, and you know how that is. James writes regularly, always asking me to send his regards to all his Pine Ridge friends. He's such a good boy, never forgets where he came from. I managed to navigate that conversational minefield without once mentioning Tommy, without acknowledging that my youngest son existed or that he'd brought shame on our family name just days earlier. The omission sat heavy in my throat like a stone, but what else was I supposed to say? That my baby boy was in jail, that I didn't know whether to bail him out or let him face the consequences, that I'd spent the morning asking God for a miraculous sign about how to handle the situation? You don't share that kind of information on a public sidewalk, no matter how well you know your neighbor or how Christian you both claim to be. Give them both my love, won't you? And you take care of yourself, Ruth. You're looking a little peaked lately, honey. Make sure you're getting enough rest and not worrying yourself sick over things you can't control. Adelaide's voice carried just enough genuine concern to let me know that she knew, that everybody in town knew, that my carefully maintained facade wasn't fooling anybody, but was appreciated nonetheless as a necessary social fiction that allowed us all to pretend that some problems were too private and too painful to be discussed in broad daylight. I thanked her for her concern and continued down Main Street, past the post office where Mrs. Mary Catherine Williams waved at me through the window with fingers stained purple from the carbon paper she used to process mail orders, past Simpson's hardware store where old Mr. Bob was arranging fishing tackle in the front window display, past the Rexall pharmacy where Dr. Peterson's wife nodded at me gravely as she emerged with a small paper bag that probably contained somebody's heart medication. Or nerve pills. Each interaction followed the same careful script: pleasant greetings, polite inquiries about health and family, compliments on appearance or recent accomplishments, absolutely no mention of anything unpleasant or shameful or difficult, even though I could see in their eyes that they all knew, they all cared, they all were probably praying for me and mine in their own private moments when Christian charity overrode social propriety. By the time I reached Henderson's First National Bank, my jaw ached from smiling and my throat was dry from making cheerful small talk when all I really wanted to do was find a quiet corner and weep for my boy, for my failures as a mother, for the prayer I'd made that morning that now seemed presumptuous and foolish in the bright light of day, and the company of neighbors who expected me to be strong, to be an example, to be the kind of Christian woman who handled her troubles with grace and dignity and never let anybody see her sweat. The bank building rose before me like a monument to respectability, all red brick and white columns and brass fixtures that spoke of stability and trust and the kind of conservative values that made Pine Ridge the kind of place where people like Harold and me had chosen to raise our children and build our lives. Mr. Henderson's grandfather had founded this bank back when the town was nothing but a railroad stop and a few scattered farms, and 3 generations of Henderson men had maintained its reputation for fair dealing and community involvement and the kind of personal service that came from knowing every customer by name and every family's financial history going back to when they first settled in Alabama. Walking through those heavy oak doors felt like stepping into a sanctuary of sorts, a place where serious business was conducted by serious people who understood the weight of responsibility and the importance of maintaining appearances even when everything in your personal life was falling apart like a house built on sand. The familiar smell of leather furniture and lemon oil and that indefinable scent of money and stability wrapped around me like a comfortable shawl, and for just a moment I allowed myself to feel grateful that I lived in a place where institutions like this still existed, where a widow could walk in wearing her best dress and carrying her mama's Bible and expect to be treated with respect and courtesy regardless of what troubles might have brought her there. Mr. Henderson himself emerged from his private office before I'd even had time to speak to the secretary, his round face creased with the kind of professional concern that bank presidents learn to wear when dealing with customers who might be facing financial difficulties. "Mrs. Whitman, what a pleasant surprise. You're looking lovely this morning. Please, come into my office where we can speak privately." His tone was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to be genuinely welcoming, serious enough to acknowledge that this probably wasn't a social call, discreet enough to make it clear that whatever we discussed would stay between us. As I followed him into that wood-paneled office with its leather chairs and heavy desk and framed photographs of Pine Ridge's founding fathers, I felt the full weight of what I was about to do: discuss my son's troubles with a man who'd known Tommy since he was in diapers, ask for help with a situation that could have been avoided if I'd been a better mother, admit that the Whitman family wasn't as perfect as we'd always appeared to be. But underneath all that anxiety and embarrassment and maternal guilt, something else was stirring, a strange sense of anticipation, as if this uncomfortable conversation might be part of something larger, part of the answer to that bold prayer I'd offered up at dawn. I settled into the chair across from Mr. Henderson's desk, smoothed my navy blue dress with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be, and prepared to do what Christian women have been doing since time immemorial: handle an impossible situation with as much grace as I could muster while trusting that somehow, someway, the Lord would make a way where there seemed to be no way. Mr. Henderson settled behind his imposing mahogany desk, the same desk his father had used before him and his grandfather before that, a piece of furniture that had witnessed more family secrets and financial crises than most folks in Pine Ridge could even imagine, and he folded his hands in that practiced way that bank presidents learn to convey both authority and compassion in equal measure. "Now then, Mrs. Whitman, what brings you in to see me this fine morning? I hope it's nothing too serious." His voice carried that particular brand of Southern courtesy that can make even the most uncomfortable conversations feel like visits between old friends, and I found myself grateful for the familiar ritual of polite small talk that would ease us both into whatever difficult territory we needed to navigate together. "Well, Mr. Henderson, I'm afraid it is somewhat serious, though I'm hopeful we can work something out that will be satisfactory to everyone involved." My voice sounded steadier than I felt, drawing on decades of experience in handling church committee meetings and school board discussions and all the other occasions when a Christian woman had to present a calm front while her heart was racing like a thoroughbred at the county fair. "As I'm sure you've heard by now, my youngest, Tommy, had himself a bit of trouble the other night, and I'm here to discuss what needs to be done to make things right with the community and with your establishment in particular." The euphemisms rolled off my tongue like honey, disguising the harsh reality of my son's public drunkenness and destructive behavior behind the kind of genteel language that allowed both of us to maintain our dignity while acknowledging that something unpleasant had occurred. Mr. Henderson nodded gravely, his expression carefully neutral in the way that professional men learn when dealing with sensitive family matters. "Yes, I did hear something about that, Mrs. Whitman. Sheriff Morrison stopped by yesterday afternoon to discuss the situation, and I want you to know that we certainly understand these things can happen to any family. The important thing is how we handle it moving forward." His words were chosen with surgical precision, acknowledging the problem without judgment, offering a path toward resolution without making me feel like a complete failure as a mother, and I felt some of the tension in my shoulders begin to ease just slightly. "I appreciate your understanding more than I can say, Mr. Henderson. Tommy broke a window in your bank's front door during his episode, and I want to make full restitution for the damage as quickly as possible. I also want to discuss what kind of arrangement we might make to ensure that this sort of thing never happens again. The conversation continued in this vein for several more minutes, with both of us dancing around the uglier details of what had actually transpired while working out the practical matters of payment schedules and repair costs and the kind of community service that might help Tommy begin to make amends for his actions. Throughout it all, I maintained the composed demeanor that had served me well through countless church meetings and social gatherings, never letting my voice crack or my hands shake, never allowing Mr. Henderson to see just how deeply this situation was tearing me apart inside. When we finally shook hands and I rose to leave his office, both of us seemed satisfied that we'd handled a delicate situation with appropriate discretion and mutual respect, and I felt a small surge of pride in my ability to manage this crisis without completely falling apart in front of one of Pine Ridge's most respected citizens. But as I walked back through that oak-paneled lobby with its marble floors and brass fixtures, past the tellers who nodded politely and the customers who offered small smiles of recognition, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still just going through the motions, still playing the part of the dignified Christian widow while my real life, the part with the desperate prayers and the wayward son and the crisis of faith that kept me awake at night, remained hidden beneath layers of social propriety and religious respectability that felt heavier with each passing step. I stepped out of that bank into the full heat of the Alabama sun, feeling like I'd successfully navigated one of the more difficult conversations of my adult life, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe that maybe things were going to work out just fine without any divine intervention or miraculous signs from heaven. The business with Mr. Henderson had gone smoother than I dared to hope, the payment arrangements were manageable, and Tommy would have a chance to work off his debt to the community through supervised labor rather than sitting in jail feeling sorry for himself and learning bad habits from other troublemakers. Maybe I'd been overthinking this whole situation, maybe my desperate prayer that morning had been the product of an overwrought imagination and too little sleep, and maybe the best thing I could do for everybody concerned was just handle Tommy's problems the same way I'd been handling family crises for the past 30 years, with practical planning, Christian charity, and the kind of determined optimism that had gotten me through Harold's death and countless other trials that had seemed insurmountable at the time but had somehow worked themselves out through a combination of hard work and faith and the simple passage of time. I was walking toward the corner of Main and Elm, planning to stop by Murphy's 5 and Dime to pick up some thread for the quilt I was making for Mary Sue's newest baby, when I saw him sitting there on the sidewalk right outside Morrison's drugstore. And everything I thought I knew about that morning, about my prayer, about God's mysterious ways, suddenly shifted like tectonic plates beneath an earthquake. He was the most ragged-looking man I'd ever seen in my life, with clothes that appeared to have been salvaged from someone's trash heap and hair that looked like it hadn't seen a comb in months, maybe years, and he was sitting cross-legged on the concrete with his back against the brick wall of Morrison's building, holding a cardboard sign that was so weathered and torn I couldn't make out what it said from where I stood. Everything about him screamed trouble, danger, the kind of person respectable folks crossed the street to avoid, the kind of individual that Sheriff Morrison would probably run out of town before supper time if enough citizens complained about his presence disturbing the peace and lowering the tone of our business district. My first instinct, bred into me by decades of small-town propriety and feminine caution, was to do exactly what every other person walking down Main Street that morning was doing: look straight ahead, quicken my pace, and pretend I hadn't noticed him at all, because acknowledging such people only encouraged them to linger and perhaps become a permanent fixture that reflected poorly on our community's standards and values. But as I got closer, something made me slow down instead of speed up, something that felt like a gentle hand on my shoulder or a quiet voice whispering in my ear, though there was nobody around me and the street was busy enough with normal Thursday morning traffic that any actual whisper would have been drowned out by the sound of automobile engines and shop doors opening and closing and the general bustle of commerce and daily life. The man looked up at me as I approached, and I was startled to see that his eyes were clear and intelligent, not the clouded gaze of someone lost to drink or mental illness, but the direct, steady look of someone who saw things clearly and wasn't afraid to meet your gaze with honesty and dignity despite his obviously desperate circumstances. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said in a voice that was roughened by weather and hardship but carried the unmistakable cadence of education and southern breeding. "I don't mean to bother you, but could I possibly have a word with you? I've been sitting here watching folks go by all morning, and something about you reminds me of my own mother, God rest her soul, and I find myself hoping that maybe you might be the kind of person who would listen to an old man's story without judging him too harshly for the circumstances that brought him to this point in his life." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were threatening or inappropriate, but because they were spoken with such genuine courtesy and unexpected eloquence that they shattered every assumption I'd made about who this man was and why he was sitting on our sidewalk looking like he hadn't had a decent meal or a safe place to sleep in longer than I cared to imagine. This wasn't the slurred speech of a drunkard or the rambling nonsense of someone whose mind had been broken by life's hardships. This was the measured, respectful tone of someone who had been raised to treat ladies with deference and who retained that fundamental courtesy even in the midst of what appeared to be complete destitution. Something deep in my chest began to flutter like a bird trying to escape from a cage, some recognition that this moment, this encounter, this ragged stranger addressing me with such unexpected grace and dignity, might be connected to the prayer I'd offered up at dawn, might be part of the answer I'd demanded from the Almighty with such presumptuous boldness that I'd spent the rest of the morning trying to talk myself out of expecting any response at all. I stood there on that sidewalk feeling like I'd been caught in some kind of spiritual trap of my own making. My good leather handbag clutched tight against my chest like armor that might protect me from whatever uncomfortable truth this encounter was threatening to reveal about who I really was beneath all my Christian charity and Sunday school teaching and decades of trying to be the kind of woman who followed Jesus' example of loving everybody regardless of their circumstances or social standing. Because if I was honest with myself, truly honest in the way that only comes in those moments when pretense becomes impossible, I had to admit that my first instinct hadn't been compassion or curiosity or even basic human decency. It had been the automatic revulsion that respectable people feel when confronted with evidence of society's failures. The instinctive desire to look away and keep walking and pretend that people like this ragged stranger didn't exist in our nice little town where everybody was supposed to know their place and maintain appropriate standards of appearance and behavior. And now here he was, speaking to me with such unexpected dignity and courtesy that I felt ashamed of every assumption I'd made about him in the space of 30 seconds, ashamed of the way I'd been ready to dismiss him as someone beneath my notice, someone whose story wasn't worth hearing because his clothes were torn and his hair was unkempt and his presence on our sidewalk represented the kind of problem that nice Christian ladies preferred to handle through anonymous donations to the church benevolence fund rather than face-to-face conversations that might force us to acknowledge the humanity of people who made us uncomfortable. I suppose I could spare a few minutes, I heard myself saying, though my voice sounded strange and uncertain to my own ears, as if someone else was speaking through me, someone braver and more Christ-like than the Ruth Whitman who had spent the morning maintaining appearances and avoiding difficult subjects and pretending that her biggest problem was a son who drank too much rather than a faith that might not be as strong or as genuine as she'd always believed it to be. Though I'm not sure what help I could be to you, sir. I'm just an ordinary woman with my own share of troubles, nothing special or wise about me that would make my opinion worth much to anybody. The words came out more honestly than I'd intended, stripped of the social pleasantries that usually cushion such interactions, and I realized that something about this man's direct gaze and respectful manner was calling out a deeper level of truth from me than I normally shared with strangers, or even with friends, for that matter. He shifted slightly against the brick wall, not standing up because that might have seemed presumptuous or threatening, but adjusting his position in a way that suggested he was settling in for a real conversation, the kind that required attention and time and the willingness to be vulnerable with someone you'd never met before and might never see again. "Ma'am, you're already helping more than you know just by stopping to listen instead of walking past like I'm invisible. Most folks today, they see someone in my condition and they make up their minds about what kind of person I must be without ever wondering what series of circumstances might have brought me to this point, or whether there might be more to my story than what shows on the surface. His voice carried a weight of experience that spoke of countless encounters with people who had judged him based on appearances alone, countless moments of being dismissed or ignored or treated as less than human simply because his external circumstances didn't meet society's standards of respectability and success. I felt heat rising in my cheeks as I recognized myself in his description, felt the sting of conviction as I realized that just minutes earlier I had been exactly the kind of person he was talking about, ready to cross the street and avoid eye contact and pretend I hadn't seen him at all rather than acknowledge that he was a human being with feelings and dignity and a story that might be worth hearing. I'm ashamed to say that you're probably right about most folks, and I'm even more ashamed to say that I was ready to be one of them until something stopped me and made me listen to what you were saying instead of just hurrying past like you weren't even there. The admission cost me something to make, because it meant acknowledging that my Christian values and my actual behavior weren't always aligned the way I liked to think they were, that there was a gap between the woman I wanted to be and the woman I actually was in moments when nobody was watching or judging or expecting me to live up to the reputation I'd spent a lifetime building. You don't need to be ashamed of an honest impulse, ma'am. We're all creatures of habit and social conditioning, all taught from childhood to be wary of what's different or unfamiliar or threatening to our sense of how the world is supposed to work. The miracle isn't that people have those reactions, the miracle is when someone like you chooses to overcome them and see past the surface to whatever truth might be hiding underneath. His words wrapped around me like a warm shawl, offering forgiveness and understanding instead of judgment, and I felt something inside me begin to soften and open in a way that I hadn't experienced in years, maybe decades. Here was this man who had every reason to be bitter and angry about the way society had treated him, who could have responded to my obvious discomfort with harsh words or demands for money or the kind of aggressive behavior that would have justified my initial fear and avoidance, and instead he was offering me grace and wisdom and a kind of gentle teaching that reminded me of Jesus himself, who had a way of turning uncomfortable encounters into opportunities for growth and revelation and deeper understanding of what it really meant to love your neighbor as yourself. I have to ask you something, sir. And I hope you won't think I'm being presumptuous or foolish, but I had what you might call a conversation with the Lord this morning, asking him to show me some truth I needed to understand, and I can't help but wonder if maybe this meeting wasn't just a coincidence but something he arranged to teach me something I need to learn. The words tumbled out before I could stop them, before the rational part of my mind could remind me that respectable church ladies don't usually share their private spiritual experiences with homeless strangers on public sidewalks, don't usually admit to believing that God might orchestrate encounters with people who don't fit into polite society's definition of appropriate messengers or teachers. But something about this man's presence, something about the way he'd spoken to me with such unexpected eloquence and courtesy, something about the timing of this encounter coming so soon after my desperate prayer for guidance, made me throw caution to the wind and speak the truth that was burning in my heart like a coal that couldn't be contained any longer. He smiled then, the first smile I'd seen from him since I'd stopped to listen, and it transformed his whole face from something weathered and worn by hardship into something that reminded me of the angels in the stained glass windows at Pine Ridge Baptist Church, beautiful and otherworldly and filled with a kind of light that didn't come from any earthly source. Ma'am, I've learned in my time on this earth that the good Lord works in mysterious ways, and he's not too proud to use broken-down old men like me to deliver his messages when he has something important to say to one of his children. If you asked him for truth this morning, then I suspect you're about to receive exactly what you asked for, even if it comes wrapped up in a package you weren't expecting. Those words hit me like a physical blow, not harsh or painful, but powerful enough to knock the breath right out of my lungs and leave me standing there on that sidewalk feeling like the whole world had suddenly shifted on its axis and I was seeing everything around me, the familiar storefronts, the passing automobiles, the ordinary people going about their ordinary business, with completely new eyes, as if I'd been walking through life half-blind and someone had just handed me a pair of spectacles that brought everything into sharp, clear focus for the first time in years. Sir, I don't even know your name, but I feel like I need to tell you about my situation, about what I asked God to help me understand this morning, because if he really did arrange this meeting between us, then maybe you're supposed to know what kind of guidance I'm seeking before you can help me find the answers I need. My voice was steadier now, filled with a strange kind of certainty that this conversation was going exactly where it needed to go, even though I had no earthly idea what that destination might look like or how I was going to feel when I arrived there. My name is William, ma'am, William Thomas Patterson, and I'd be honored to hear whatever you feel comfortable sharing with a stranger who probably has no business offering advice to a fine Christian lady like yourself, but who's willing to listen with an open heart and share whatever wisdom the good Lord might have given him through his own trials and tribulations. The way he spoke his name, with such simple dignity despite his obvious circumstances, made me realize that this man had once been somebody respectable, somebody with a family and a home and a place in the world, somebody who had fallen from grace in ways that I could only imagine but whose essential character had somehow survived whatever disasters had brought him to this point of sitting on sidewalks and depending on the kindness of strangers for his daily survival. Mr. Patterson, my youngest son is 19 years old, and he's breaking my heart with the choices he's making. 3 nights ago he was arrested for public drunkenness and causing a disturbance, and it wasn't the first time, just the latest in a series of incidents that have me wondering whether I've been too soft on him, too quick to make excuses and bail him out of trouble instead of letting him face the consequences of his actions like a man. The words poured out of me like water from a broken dam, all the worry and guilt and confusion I'd been carrying for months spilling onto that public sidewalk in front of a man I'd known for less than 10 minutes but who somehow felt like the safest person in the world to confide in at that moment. This morning I asked God to show me the truth about what I should do, whether to keep trying to save Tommy from himself or step back and let him learn his lessons the hard way, even if it means watching him fall further than I ever imagined possible. I asked for a sign, Mr. Patterson, something clear and unmistakable that would help me understand how to love my boy in the way God wants me to love him, rather than in the way that feels natural and comfortable to a mother who can't bear to see her child suffer. Mr. Patterson nodded slowly, his weathered face creased with the kind of understanding that comes only from personal experience with the exact type of pain I was describing, and I knew before he spoke another word that this man had walked the same dark path I was traveling now, had faced the same impossible choice between enabling and abandoning, between holding on and letting go, between the love that protects and the love that allows natural consequences to teach the lessons that no amount of maternal worry and intervention could ever provide. Mrs. Whitman, he said, and I realized I'd never told him my name, which should have startled me but somehow didn't because this whole conversation had moved beyond the realm of normal social interactions into something that felt more like divine appointment than chance encounter. I had a son once, a boy who could have been Tommy's twin brother from the sound of things, and I spent years of my life trying to save him from himself, making excuses for his behavior, paying his debts, cleaning up his messes, believing that if I just loved him enough and supported him enough and never gave up on him, eventually he'd come to his senses and turn his life around like the prodigal son in Jesus' parable. His voice carried the weight of deep sorrow, but also something else, a kind of hard-won wisdom that comes only from living through experiences that strip away all illusions about how the world works and what love really means when it's tested by impossible circumstances and heartbreaking choices. I told myself I was being a good father, a Christian father, following the example of our Heavenly Father who never gives up on his children no matter how far they stray from his will. But what I was really doing was enabling my boy's destruction, making it possible for him to keep making the same mistakes over and over again because he knew old dad would always be there to cushion the fall, always be there with money for bail or excuses for his behavior or someone else to blame for the consequences of his choices. The pain in his voice was so raw, so immediate, that I felt tears starting to blur my vision as I recognized my own story being told by someone who had walked this path before me and could see the destination I was heading toward with terrifying clarity. "What happened to your son, Mr. Patterson?" I whispered, though part of me didn't want to know the answer, didn't want to hear what might be waiting at the end of the road I'd been traveling with Tommy, what final disaster might be lurking just around the corner if I continued down the same path of well-intentioned enabling that had brought this man to his current state of homelessness and desperation. "He died, Mrs. Whitman. Overdosed on heroin in a filthy alley behind a bar in Montgomery, Alabama, 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days ago, and the last words he ever spoke to me were lies about where he'd been and what he needed money for and how he was going to get his life together if I would just help him one more time. His voice broke slightly on the last few words, but he continued speaking with the kind of determined honesty that comes from someone who has learned that the truth, no matter how painful, is always preferable to the comfortable lies we tell ourselves when reality becomes too hard to face. The coroner told me later that if I'd stopped helping him 6 months earlier, if I'd let him face the consequences of his actions and hit rock bottom while he was still young enough and strong enough to climb back out, he might still be alive today. Instead, my love, my misguided, enabling, destructive love, killed him as surely as if I'd put that needle in his arm myself. The words hung in the air between us like a physical presence, heavy and terrible and completely undeniable, and I felt something inside me crumble and reshape itself as I finally understood what God was trying to tell me through this broken-down stranger who had lost everything, including the son he'd been trying to save through all the wrong methods and for all the wrong reasons. Sometimes, ma'am, sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is let them fall down hard enough to realize they need to get back up on their own. Sometimes love means saying no instead of yes, means stepping back instead of stepping in, means trusting God to teach the lessons you can't teach and trusting your child to learn them, even if it means watching them suffer in ways that break your heart into a million pieces. He reached into his tattered coat pocket and pulled out a photograph so worn and creased it was barely recognizable, but I could make out the image of a young man with kind eyes and a smile that reminded me heartbreakingly of Tommy in his better moments, before the drinking and the wildness had hardened his features and dimmed the light in his eyes. "This is my boy, Mrs. Whitman." His name was David, and he was the sweetest child you ever saw until the world got hold of him and convinced him that he needed something more than what his family and his faith could provide. I loved him enough to enable his destruction, and now I carry that guilt with me every day, along with the knowledge that if I'd been brave enough to let him face the consequences of his choices earlier, he might have learned to make better ones while there was still time. I took the photograph with trembling hands, staring down at the face of someone else's son who had walked the same path my Tommy was walking, someone else's boy who had been lost to the kind of misguided parental love that cushions every fall and prevents the hard lessons that sometimes have to be learned before real change becomes possible. "Mr. Patterson, are you telling me that I should let Tommy stay in jail? That I should stop trying to help him, stop making excuses for him, stop believing that maybe this time will be different if I just find the right words or the right approach or the right amount of Christian love to turn his heart around?" The questions came out in a rush, desperate and afraid but also filled with a strange kind of relief, as if some part of me had been waiting for permission to stop carrying a burden that was too heavy for any one person to bear, waiting for someone to tell me that sometimes the most courageous thing a mother can do is trust God more than she trusts her own maternal instincts. "Yes, ma'am, that's exactly what I'm telling you," Mr. Patterson said, and his voice carried such gentle certainty that I felt something inside me settle into place like a key finding its lock, like a puzzle piece that had been searching for its proper position finally clicking into the spot where it belonged. "I'm telling you that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone you love is the opportunity to face the full weight of their choices without a safety net. Without someone rushing in to cushion the fall or minimize the consequences or provide an escape route that prevents them from learning what they desperately need to learn about how the world really works and what it costs to live outside the boundaries of decent behavior and moral responsibility." He handed the photograph back to me, and as our fingers touched briefly during the exchange, I felt a strange warmth pass between us, something that reminded me of the feeling I used to get during communion at church when the presence of the Holy Spirit felt so real and immediate that I could hardly breathe for the wonder of it. "Your Tommy is blessed to have a mother who loves him enough to ask God for wisdom instead of just assuming she knows what's best, blessed to have someone who cares more about his eternal soul than about her own comfort or reputation or the opinions of neighbors who don't have to live with the consequences of the decisions you make in the privacy of your own heart and the sacred space of your own prayers." I stood there holding that worn photograph, looking down at the face of someone else's lost son, and I felt the last of my resistance crumble away like sand castles hit by ocean waves. This was it, the answer I'd begged God to provide, delivered through the most unlikely messenger imaginable, a homeless man sitting on a sidewalk who had walked the exact path I was walking and could speak from first-hand experience about where it led if you stayed on it too long, enabled too much, loved in all the wrong ways for all the seemingly right reasons. Mr. Patterson, I believe with all my heart that God sent you to me this morning, sent you to tell me what I needed to hear but was too afraid to face on my own. I asked him to show me the truth, and you've given me the most painful, beautiful, necessary truth I could ever have imagined. I reached into my handbag, past Mama's Bible with its worn leather cover and yellowing pages, and pulled out my wallet, extracting every dollar I had with me, nearly $20 that I'd brought in case Mr. Henderson required some kind of deposit or down payment for Tommy's damages. I want you to have this, not because I think money can repay what you've given me this morning, but because I believe the Lord wants me to share what little I have with someone who has shared something far more valuable with me, the wisdom that comes from experience and the courage to tell a difficult truth when someone desperately needs to hear it. Mr. Patterson accepted the money with the same dignity he'd shown throughout our conversation, not with the grasping desperation I might have expected from someone in his circumstances, but with the quiet grace of someone who understood that this exchange was about more than financial transaction. It was about one broken human being helping another find their way through the darkness of impossible choices and heartbreaking decisions. Thank you, Mrs. Whitman, not just for your generosity but for stopping to listen when you could have walked past, for treating me like a human being instead of a problem to be avoided, for having the courage to ask God for guidance and the wisdom to recognize His answer when it came in a form you weren't expecting. He stood up then, moving with surprising agility for someone who had appeared so weathered and worn down by life's hardships, and as he rose to his full height I was struck again by the incongruity between his raggedy appearance and the unmistakable dignity that emanated from him like light from a lantern. Warm and steady and somehow reassuring despite everything he'd shared about loss and regret and the terrible consequences of well-intentioned mistakes. I'll be praying for you and your Tommy, ma'am, praying that you'll have the strength to love him the way God loves all of us, with boundaries and consequences and the kind of tough grace that allows people to learn from their mistakes instead of being protected from them. And I'll be praying that Tommy will have the wisdom to recognize the gift you're giving him when you step back and let him face his choices like a man instead of hiding behind his mama's skirts like a child who never learned to take responsibility for his actions. I wanted to ask him where he was going, whether there was anything else I could do to help him, whether we might meet again someday under better circumstances, but when I looked around after tucking my wallet back into my handbag, he was simply gone, not walking away down the sidewalk or around the corner of the building, but completely absent from the spot where he'd been standing just seconds before, as if he'd never been there at all except for the lingering warmth in my heart and the photograph I was still holding and the absolute certainty that I had just experienced something miraculous, something that would change the course of my life and Tommy's life in ways I couldn't yet fully comprehend but was finally ready to trust and embrace with all the faith I could muster. I walked home in a silence so profound it felt like stepping into a cathedral during prayer time, when even the slightest whisper seems like sacrilege and the only appropriate response to the sacred is complete stillness of both body and spirit. The familiar streets of Pine Ridge looked exactly the same as they had that morning when I'd walked them with such different eyes and such a different heart, the same white picket fences and front porch swings, the same oak trees casting the same patterns of shadow and sunlight across the same sidewalks where I'd walked thousands of times over the course of my 82 years, but everything felt transformed, as if I was seeing my hometown through new eyes that had been washed clean by tears. I hadn't even realized I was crying until I felt them drying on my cheeks in the Alabama heat. Mrs. Thornton was no longer on her front porch, probably gone inside to start preparing lunch for her husband who would be home from the feed store in another hour, and the other neighbors who had greeted me with such careful courtesy that morning were nowhere to be seen, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the echo of Mr. Patterson's words that seemed to follow me like a gentle hand on my shoulder, guiding me toward a truth I'd been running from for months without even realizing I was running. The photograph was still clutched in my other hand, that image of someone else's lost son serving as a tangible reminder that what had just happened on that sidewalk outside Morrison's drugstore wasn't a dream or a hallucination or the product of an overactive imagination, but a real encounter with a real person who had shared real wisdom born from real pain and real loss, and the kind of hard-earned understanding that comes only from walking through fire and somehow managing to emerge on the other side with your faith intact even when everything else has been burned away. I thought about Tommy sitting in that jail cell, probably angry and bitter and full of self-pity, probably expecting me to show up any minute with bail money and apologies and the same old promises to fix everything if he would just promise to do better next time. Promises we'd both made and broken so many times that they'd lost all meaning except as a ritual we performed to maintain the illusion that something was actually changing when nothing was changing at all except the depth of the hole. He was digging for himself and the height of the walls I was building around him to protect him from the very consequences that might actually save his life if I could find the courage to let them do their work. The thought of leaving him there, of not rushing to his rescue the way I'd done so many times before, felt like someone was asking me to cut off my own arm or stop breathing or commit some other act of self-destruction that went against every maternal instinct I'd developed over the course of raising 3 children and loving them through every stage of their lives from helpless infancy to complicated adulthood. But underneath that natural revulsion at the idea of stepping back and letting Tommy face his troubles alone, I felt something else growing, a strange kind of peace that I could only describe as the presence of God Himself, settling into my heart like a warm blanket on a cold night, assuring me that sometimes the hardest thing to do is also the most loving thing to do, that sometimes protecting someone from consequences is actually the cruelest form of enabling, that sometimes love requires the kind of strength that looks like abandonment to everyone watching from the outside but is actually the deepest expression of faith in another person's ability to learn and grow and change if given the opportunity and the motivation that comes from facing reality without a safety net. By the time I reached my own front gate, the one Harold had painted green every spring because he said it reminded him of new life and fresh starts, I had made up my mind about what I was going to do, or rather what I was not going to do, and the decision sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and uncomfortable but also solid and unshakable. The kind of foundation you could build a life on if you were brave enough to trust that God knew what He was doing even when His ways seemed harsh or confusing or completely contrary to everything your human heart wanted to believe about love and mercy and second chances. I climbed those front porch steps slowly, feeling every one of my 82 years in my joints and muscles, but also feeling something else, a lightness of spirit that came from finally releasing a burden I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten how much it weighed, finally admitting that I couldn't save Tommy from himself and that maybe, just maybe, trying to save him was actually preventing him from discovering that he had the strength to save himself if he could find the motivation and the courage to reach for the hand of the only one who could truly pull him out of the pit he'd been digging with such determination and skill. I settled into that familiar rocking chair on my front porch, the same chair where the day had begun with such desperate pleading and uncertainty, but now everything felt different, the weight of the wood beneath me, the rhythm of the creaking floorboards, even the way the afternoon light filtered through the leaves of Harold's old peach tree seemed to carry a message of peace and rightness that I hadn't felt in months, maybe years. The first thing I did was reach into my handbag and pull out Mama's Bible, opening it not to any particular passage but just letting it fall open where it would, the way she used to do when she was looking for guidance or comfort or confirmation that the decisions she was making were in line with God's will and His perfect plan for her life and the lives of the people she loved. The pages fell open to the book of Proverbs, chapter 13, and my eyes were drawn immediately to verse 24, He that spareth his rod hateth his son, but he that loveth him chasteneth him betimes. The words seemed to glow on the page like they'd been written specifically for this moment, for this decision, for this mother who had been sparing the rod of natural consequences for so long that she'd nearly destroyed the son she was trying to protect from the very discipline that might have saved his soul and his future if she'd had the courage to apply it when it would have done the most good. I read the verse again, slowly this time, letting each word sink into my heart like rain into parched ground. And I felt something shift inside me, not the painful wrenching of doubt and fear that had characterized my thoughts about Tommy for so long, but a quiet settling of certainty, As if all the scattered pieces of my maternal heart were finally falling into their proper places and forming a picture that made sense even though it was nothing like the picture I'd been trying to create. Through years of well-intentioned interference and misguided rescue attempts. The telephone rang inside the house, its shrill sound cutting through the afternoon stillness like a knife, and I knew without answering who it would be. Sheriff Morrison, probably, or maybe one of Tommy's drinking buddies, or possibly even Tommy himself if they'd given him his one phone call and he'd chosen to use it to plead with his mama to come bail him out of this latest predicament the same way she'd bailed him out of all the others that had led him deeper and deeper into the kind of trouble that only gets worse when there are no real consequences attached to the choices that create it. I listened to that telephone ring 6 times, 7 times, 8 times, each ring feeling like a test of my resolve and my faith in the wisdom that Mr. Patterson had shared with me on that sidewalk, each ring asking me whether I was really going to follow through with the hardest decision I'd ever made as a mother or whether I was going to lose my nerve and go running to Tommy's rescue one more time, perpetuating the cycle that was slowly but surely destroying both of us in different ways. On the 9th ring, the sound stopped, and the silence that followed felt like a benediction, like a confirmation from heaven itself that I was doing the right thing even though it felt wrong in every fiber of my maternal being. Even though every instinct I'd developed over 19 years of loving and worrying about Tommy was screaming at me to pick up that phone and do whatever needed to be done to get my boy out of that jail cell and back home where I could keep an eye on him and try once more to convince him to change his ways through the power of unconditional love and endless second chances. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was, rocking gently in Harold's handmade chair, reading that verse about loving discipline over and over until it became less like words on a page and more like a prayer, a promise, a covenant between me and God that I would trust him to work in Tommy's life through circumstances and consequences that I couldn't control or manipulate or soften with my maternal interference, that I would love my son enough to let him fall as far as he needed to fall in order to understand that he had the choice to get back up and start over, but that the choice would have to be his and his alone, without his mama running interference or providing escape routes or making it easy for him to avoid the hard work of genuine repentance and real change. The afternoon sun was starting to slant toward evening by the time I closed that Bible and tucked it back into my handbag, and I realized that for the first time in months I wasn't worried about Tommy, wasn't planning my next move in the endless chess game of trying to stay one step ahead of his self-destructive choices, wasn't carrying the crushing weight of responsibility for another adult's decisions and their consequences. He was in God's hands now, truly and completely in God's hands in a way that he'd never been as long as I was standing between him and the natural results of his actions, and I felt something I'd almost forgotten was possible, a deep, abiding peace that comes from finally surrendering control of something that was never mine to control in the first place, finally admitting that the best thing I could do for my son was to step back and trust the Lord to do what only he could do in the secret places of a human heart that no earthly love, no matter how deep or desperate or determined, can ever truly reach or change. 3 years later, I'm sitting in that same rocking chair on the same front porch, but the woman who sits here now is not the same woman who sat here that July morning in 1959, pleading with God for a sign about how to save her wayward son from the consequences of his own choices. This morning, like every morning since that day, I rise at 5 o'clock and make my way to this weathered wooden sanctuary with Mama's Bible in my hands, but now my prayers are different, less desperate, less demanding, more filled with gratitude than with anguish, more focused on thanksgiving than on petitioning heaven for miracles that might not be miracles at all but interference with the very process God uses to shape souls and build character and teach the kind of lessons that can only be learned through experience rather than through the well-meaning warnings of people who love us enough to want to protect us from every hardship and every consequence that might actually serve to make us stronger, wiser, more capable of standing on our own 2 feet without leaning on crutches that ultimately weaken rather than support. Tommy spent 6 months in that jail cell, 6 months that I didn't visit except for one brief conversation through the bars when he'd finally stopped asking me to bail him out and started asking me to forgive him for all the pain and worry and heartbreak he'd caused through his selfish choices and reckless behavior. He came home different, quieter, more thoughtful, carrying himself with the kind of dignity that comes from facing your mistakes head-on and taking responsibility for the damage they've caused instead of blaming circumstances or other people or the unfairness of life for problems that you created through your own poor judgment and lack of self-control. He found work at Henderson's lumber yard, steady work that requires him to show up on time and sober every day, and he's been attending church with me again. Not because I nagged him or threatened him or made it a condition of living under my roof, but because he wanted to, because he'd discovered during those long months in jail that there was a God-shaped hole in his life that couldn't be filled with alcohol or wild living or the approval of friends who weren't really friends at all but fellow travelers on the road to destruction who would disappear the moment the party ended and the bills came due. I still think about Mr. Patterson every morning when I settle into this chair. Still wonder who he really was and where he came from and whether he was an angel sent by God or just a broken man who had learned to see clearly through the lens of his own tragic loss. But I suppose it doesn't matter because the wisdom he shared that day was true regardless of its source. And the peace I found through following his advice has been worth every difficult moment of watching Tommy learn to stand on his own instead of leaning on his mama's misguided attempts to cushion every fall and soften every blow that life might choose to deliver to teach him what he needed to know about strength and resilience and the grace that comes from accepting responsibility for your actions instead of always looking for someone else to blame. So when people ask me how I learned to let go of a child I loved more than my own life, how I found the courage to stop enabling and start trusting, how I knew that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is absolutely nothing at all, I tell them about a ragged stranger who appeared on a sidewalk in Pine Ridge, Alabama, on a Thursday morning when I was desperate enough to ask God for a miracle and humble enough to recognize it when it came disguised as someone I almost ignored, someone I almost dismissed, someone who looked nothing like what I expected divine wisdom to look like but who carried more truth in his broken heart than all the Sunday school lessons and prayer meetings and Christian books I'd absorbed over 8 decades of faithful church attendance. I tell them that God doesn't always send his answers wrapped in golden ribbons with angel choruses announcing their arrival. Sometimes he sends them wearing torn clothes and carrying cardboard signs, speaking through voices roughened by hardship but carrying messages that can save your soul and your family if you're willing to listen with something deeper than your ears, if you're willing to see with something clearer than your eyes, if you're willing to believe that the Almighty who created the universe is not too proud to use the least and the lost and the lonely to teach the greatest lessons about love and faith and the kind of courage it takes to let go when everything inside you wants to hold on. My Tommy is 22 years old now, married to a sweet girl from the next county over, working hard and living right and raising his own children with the kind of firm but loving discipline that comes from understanding the difference between protection and enabling, between mercy and foolishness, between the love that rescues and the love that allows people to rescue themselves with God's help and their own determination to do better than they've done before. And every morning when I sit in this chair and watch the Alabama sun rise over the cotton fields that have witnessed generations of families learning the same hard lessons about faith and forgiveness and the mysterious ways that grace works in human lives, I whisper a prayer of gratitude for a homeless man named William Patterson who gave me the most precious gift anyone had ever given me, permission to trust God more than I trusted my own maternal instincts, permission to believe that sometimes stepping back is the bravest thing you can do, permission to love my son enough to let him fall so he could learn to stand. If this story has touched your heart, if you've been struggling with your own impossible choice between holding on and letting go, leave me a comment below and tell me about it. Sometimes we all need to know that we're not alone in these battles, that other folks have walked these same dark paths and found their way to the light on the other side. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because this old grandmother has plenty more stories to share about the ways God works in ordinary lives through extraordinary circumstances, about the miracles that hide in everyday encounters, and about the truth that can set you free if you're brave enough to receive it, even when it comes from the most unexpected messengers.